In the year 1814, a woman of 28 was considered a relic, a silent shadow destined to fade into the wallpaper of London's grandest ballrooms. But Althea Vance was no shadow. As the head housekeeper of Thorne House, she was the silent commander of a stone fortress, carrying a ring of keys like a scepter and a mind far sharper than the silver she polished. She had long ago traded the marriage mart for the cold, hard reality of survival, and she did so with a grace that bordered on arrogance. She was a spinster, with a gaze that could make a butler stutter, and a wit that served as her only protection. The night was thick with the scent of ozone and the relentless rhythm of a summer storm. Inside the vast, mahogany-clad library of the estate, Julian, the Viscount Thorne, was attempting to drown his boredom in a glass of amber liquid that cost more than Althea's yearly salary. Julian was a man defined by his restlessness, a dark-haired, broad-shouldered aristocrat who found the world increasingly tedious because no one ever dared to say no to him. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Althea stepped in, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. She didn't wait for a summons. She never did. She placed a fresh decanter on the side table with a precision that was almost an insult. "The hour is late, my lord. Even the horses have had the sense to go to sleep. Perhaps you should follow their lead before you finish that bottle and start a conversation with the drapes." Julian didn't turn around. He stayed staring at the rain lashing against the glass. "You forget your place, Miss Vance. Or perhaps you've simply decided that your age gives you the right to be insufferable." Althea smoothed her pristine white apron, her hazel eyes flashing with a dangerous intelligence. "My age, my lord, gives me the perspective you lack, and my place is currently the only reason this house hasn't descended into the same chaos as your personal life. If telling you the truth makes me insufferable, then I shall wear the title with more pride than you wear yours." Julian turned then, his movements slow and predatory. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the way her dark mahogany hair was pulled back, so tightly it should have been painful. Yet a few rebellious strands had escaped a frame of face that was far too handsome for a servant. "You've been in my service for 3 years, Althea. 3 years of biting remarks and perfect ledgers. Tell me, do you ever stop thinking? Do you ever just exist without a plan to undermine me?" "I don't undermine you, Julian," she said, dropping the formal "my lord" like a gauntlet between them. The air in the room suddenly felt twice as heavy. "I simply refuse to pretend that your title makes your opinions interesting. You are bored because you surround yourself with echoes. I am the only voice in this house that doesn't sound like your own." He took a step toward her, the firelight catching the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "An echo is safe. An echo doesn't challenge a man's sanity at midnight." He moved closer still, crossing the distance until he could smell the faint, clean scent of lavender and soap that always clung to her. "Why aren't you married, Althea? A woman with your fire. Surely some country squire would have braved your tongue for the sake of your eyes." Althea didn't retreat. She tilted her chin up, meeting his gaze with a defiant smirk. "Because, my lord, I found that I prefer my own company to the burden of a man who required constant management. I have enough work looking after your estate. I didn't see the need to take on a husband as a hobby. Besides, most men find intelligence in a woman to be a decorative inconvenience. I find it to be a survival instinct. And what if I told you I don't find it inconvenient at all?" Julian's voice dropped an octave, becoming a low, vibrating rasp that sent a traitorous shiver down Althea's spine. He reached out, not to touch her, but to trace the air just inches from her shoulder. "What if I told you that your survival instinct is the only thing that has kept me from losing my mind this season?" "Then I would say the wine has finally reached your brain," she whispered, though her breath was hitching in her throat. The library was a cavern of shadows, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth. They were alone. The world of masters and servants felt miles away. replaced by a raw, magnetic pull that neither of them could justify. "It's not the wine," Julian said, his hand finally making contact. He tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on the sensitive skin of her neck. The touch was electric, a spark that ignited 3 years of suppressed tension. Althea felt her pulse racing, a frantic drumming against her ribs. She was a clever one. She was the one who always had an answer. But as Julian leaned down, his face inches from hers, she found that her mind was suddenly, terrifyingly blank. "You should leave," she breathed, though she made no move to escape. "I am in my own house, Althea," he murmured against her lips. "And for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I am supposed to be." He didn't wait for her to argue. He didn't give her the chance to reclaim her sharp tongue. He captured her mouth in a kiss that was part desperation and part discovery. It wasn't the kiss of a gentleman. It was the kiss of a man who had been starving and had finally found a feast. Althea gasped, her hands flying to his chest, intending to push him away, but her fingers curled into fine silk of his waistcoat instead, pulling him closer. The scandal of it should have frozen her blood. She was 28, a housekeeper, a woman whose reputation was her only currency. But in the dark of the library, with the rain screaming outside and Julian's tongue tracing the seam of her lips, she felt a fire she had thought long dead roar back to life. She wasn't just a servant. She wasn't just a spinster. She was a woman being worshipped by a king, and God help her, she wanted to burn. The morning light was a cruel witness. It filtered through the high windows of Thorne House, indifferent to the fact that the world had shifted on its axis the night before. Althea was awake long before the sun, her spine as rigid as a bayonet as she supervised the dusting of the grand foyer. To the under-housemaids, she was the same formidable Miss Vance, flawless, untouchable, and perhaps a bit more sharp-tongued than usual. But beneath the charcoal silk of her bodice, her skin still burned where Julian's hands had roamed. Her mind, usually a sanctuary of logic, was a chaotic battlefield of how could you and when can we do it again? She had convinced herself that the kiss in the library was a momentary lapse, a product of lightning and too much brandy. On his part, at least, she was a woman of nearly 30. She was supposed to be immune to the charms of a rogue, even a titled one. But when the clock struck 11, the heavy thud of boots on the staircase made her breath catch. Julian appeared, looking irritatingly refreshed for a man who had spent his night behaving like a libertine. He didn't head for the breakfast room. He walked straight toward Althea, who was currently inspecting the silver in the dining hall. He dismissed the footman with a mere flick of his wrist, a gesture that spoke of centuries of inherited power. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice carrying that low, honeyed vibration that made her toes curl in her boots. "I find I have a grievance with the household management." Althea didn't turn around. She polished the silver spoon with unnecessary vigor. "The grievances are usually handled in the study between the hours of 9 and 10. My lord, you are late. Again." Julian stepped into her personal space, his shadow falling over her hands. "I'm not talking about the ledgers, Althea. I'm talking about the silence. I woke up expecting a lecture, or perhaps a slap. Instead, I found an empty library and a very cold bed." Althea finally turned, her eyes narrowed and blazing with a mix of fury and desire. "You found exactly what you deserved, my lord, a return to reality. Whatever madness took hold of us in the dark has no place in the light of day. I am your housekeeper. You are the Viscount Thorne. If you've forgotten the social hierarchy, I'm sure the nearest debutante would be happy to remind you." Julian leaned one hand against the sideboard, effectively pinning her between his body and the silver. "The nearest debutante has the intellectual depth of a puddle, Althea, and she certainly doesn't look at me as if she wants to murder me and kiss me in the same breath. Don't hide behind your keys. It's beneath you, and this is above you." she countered, gesturing to the mere inches between them. Harassing your staff in broad daylight? If the Dowager Duchess were to walk in, your reputation would be the least of our worries. I would be on the street and you would be, well, you'd just find another girl to torment. Julian's expression shifted. The playful arrogance vanished, replaced by a raw, startling intensity. Is that what you think this is? Torment? I've spent 3 years trying to provoke a reaction from you, because a reaction from you is worth more than 1,000, yes, my lords, from anyone else. You think you're a spinster waiting to happen, but Althea, you are the most vibrant, infuriating, and irresistible woman I have ever known, and I think you're terrified of it. I am terrified of being a fool, she whispered, her resolve crumbling like dry parchment. I have worked too hard for my independence to throw it away for a night of whatever that was. It wasn't a night, Julian said, his voice dropping to a seductive rasp. He reached out, his thumb grazing the pulse point at her wrist. It was a beginning, and if you think I'm going to let you retreat into your ledgers and your starch, you haven't been paying attention for the last 3 years. Julian, please, she breathed, the use of his name a surrender. Tonight, he commanded, not as a master, but as a man who would not be denied. The terrace, after the house has gone to sleep. If you don't come, I'll assume you're the coward. I know you aren't. But if you do, I'll show you exactly how little I care about social hierarchies. He backed away then, leaving her gasping for air in the sudden vacuum of his presence. Althea looked down at the spoon in her hand. It was polished to a mirror shine. In its reflection, she saw a woman she barely recognized, a woman with flushed cheeks and eyes that were no longer looking at the past, but staring hungrily at a very dangerous future. She had a choice. She could stay in her room, safe and lonely, or she could walk onto that terrace and risk every scrap of dignity she possessed for a man who had finally made her feel seen. But as Julian reached the door, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. By the way, Althea, he added with a wicked glint in his eyes, that emerald dress you wore last night, it's far too distracting. Wear it again. The moon was a sliver of silver bone in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the terrace of Thorne House. The air was thick and humid, smelling of damp earth and a heavy, sweet perfume of night-blooming jasmine. Althea stood by the stone balustrade, her fingers gripping the cold marble until her knuckles turned white. She had worn the emerald dress. It was a reckless act, a silent admission that she was no longer playing the role of the dutiful servant. The silk whispered against her legs, a scandalous sound in the dead of night. She told herself she was here to end this, to give him a piece of her mind and return to the safety of her ledgers. But the frantic pulse in her throat told a different story. I half expected you to send a footman with a note saying you had a headache. A voice drawled from the shadows. Althea didn't turn. She knew that voice. It was the sound of trouble wrapped in velvet. A headache would imply that I find you overwhelming. My lord, I assure you, you are merely a persistent inconvenience. Julian stepped into moonlight, and Althea's breath hitched. He had discarded his coat and cravat. His white shirt was open at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked powerful and dangerously warm. He looked less like a viscount and more like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. You wore the dress, he noted, his eyes traveling over her with a slow, deliberate heat that made Althea feel as though she were standing too close to an open flame. It was at the top of the trunk, she lied, her voice remarkably steady. Do not read into it, Julian. I am here because I will not be called a coward by a man who spends his days deciding which waistcoat best matches his boredom. Julian laughed, stepping closer until he was mere inches away. Your tongue is a marvel, Althea. Even now, when your heart is beating so hard I can see against the silk, you still try to cut me down. Why are you so afraid of being wanted? Because being wanted is temporary, she snapped, finally turned to face him. Her hazel eyes were bright, with unshed tears of frustration. You want me because I am a puzzle you haven't solved, because I am the clever spinster who doesn't fall at your feet. But what happens when the puzzle is solved? I will still be Althea Vance, a woman with no dowry and a stained reputation, and you will still be the Viscount Thorne, looking for your next distraction. The mocking glint in Julian's eyes died instantly. He reached out, his hands heavy and sure as they landed on her waist. Althea gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to rest on his chest. You think so little of me, he whispered, his voice raw, and so little of yourself. I don't want a puzzle, Althea. I want the woman who looked at the ruins of her life and decided to build a kingdom out of keys and silver polish. I want the woman who is smarter than every man I've ever met. I want you. You can't have me, she breathed, even as she leaned into his heat. The world won't allow it. Then we will create a world that does, he countered. He slid one hand up her spine, his fingers tangling in the dark mahogany curls at the nape of her neck. He tilted her head back, forcing her to look at him. Tell me to stop, Althea. Tell me you feel nothing when I touch you, and I will walk away and never speak to you again. I will be the perfect, boring master, and you can go back to your quiet, lonely life. Just say the word. Althea looked into his dark eyes, searching for a lie, for a hint of the rogue she had spent years avoiding. She found only a reflection of her own hunger. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of her decision. She could be safe, or she could be alive. I hate you, she whispered, her voice breaking. I know, he replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. I hate how you look at me. I hate how you make me forget every rule I've ever lived by. She reached up, her fingers sliding into his dark hair, pulling him down. And I hate that I don't want you to stop. The kiss that followed was an explosion. It wasn't the tentative exploration of the library. It was a desperate, starving reclamation. Julian backed her against a stone pillar, his body pinning hers with possessive weight. Althea moaned into his mouth, her senses overwhelmed by the scent of him, the taste of him, and the sheer, intoxicating power of being desired by a man who saw her for exactly who she was. His hands were everywhere, tracing the curve of her hip, the line of her throat, pulling her closer until there was no air left between them. The fire that had been simmering for 3 years had finally turned into a conflagration. On that terrace, under the watchful eye of the moon, Althea Vance ceased to be the invisible housekeeper. She was a woman of fire and wit, and she was finally taking what she wanted. The terrace was no longer a place of stone and moonlight. It had become a sanctuary of heat and forbidden promises. Julian's hands, usually so controlled and graceful, were now frantic as they explored the curves of Althea's body. He pulled her flush against him, his hardness leaving no doubt about the depth of his desire. Althea arched her back, a soft, broken sound escaping her lips as his mouth moved from her lips to the sensitive line of her throat. You are going to be the ruin of me, Althea Vance. Julian groaned against her skin. I've spent a lifetime following the rules of my station, but for one more minute of this, I would burn every title I own. Althea's hands were busy, too. She had unbuttoned his waistcoat, her palms flat against the thin linen of his shirt, feeling the thunderous rhythm of his heart. Then let us be ruined together, she whispered, her voice thick with a hunger she no longer tried to hide. For tonight, there is no Viscount. There is only a man who has finally met his match. Julian didn't respond with words. He swept her up into his arms, his strength effortless, and carried her back toward the library's open French doors. He kicked them shut behind him, plunging them into the amber-lit intimacy of the room. He didn't take her to the sofa this time. He pressed her against the heavy mahogany desk, the very symbol of his authority, and let his hand slide the emerald silk up her thighs. The contrast of the cool air and his scorching touch made Althea gasp. She wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him into the cradle of her hips. Every touch was an interrogation, a demand for truth. "Is this what you wanted, Julian?" she teased, her wit returning even in the midst of passion. "To have your housekeeper on the table where you sign your laws?" "I want you anywhere I can have you," he rasped, his eyes dark with a possessive fire. "On this desk, in my bed, in the middle of a ballroom. I want the world to know that you belong to me and I to you." He leaned down, his kiss deeper, more predatory, tasting of wine and absolute surrender. But just as the world seemed to dissolve into pure sensation, a sharp click echoed from a hallway, the sound of a heavy door closing, followed by the muffled rhythm of footsteps. They froze. The sudden silence of the house was deafening. Althea's heart nearly stopped. If a servant found them like this, disheveled, intertwined, and scandalous, her life as she knew it was over. Julian's jaw tightened, his protective instinct flaring. He didn't move away. He shielded her with his body, his eyes fixed on the library door. The footsteps lingered for a moment, then faded into the distance toward the kitchen wing. The danger had passed, but the spell had been bruised. Althea let out a jagged breath, her forehead resting against Julian's shoulder. "We are playing with fire, Julian. One more second, and we would have been ashes." Julian pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. He didn't look afraid. He looked resolved. He smoothed her hair, his touch surprisingly tender. "Then it's time we stop playing. I am tired of the shadows, Althea. I am tired of pretending that you are just a part of the furniture." "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I am saying that I am going to country tomorrow. To my estate in Kent," he said, his voice firm with a newfound purpose. "And you are coming with me, not as my housekeeper, as my guest. We will find a way, Althea. I don't care about the gossips or the Queen herself. I've spent 28 years waiting for someone who makes me feel this alive. I'm not letting you go back to polishing silver while I dream of your skin." Althea looked at him. The sharp, cynical Althea wanted to point out 1,000 reasons why it wouldn't work. But for once, her heart was louder than her head. She saw the man behind the title, the man who was willing to risk his world for a woman everyone else had discarded. "Kent is beautiful this time of year," she whispered, a small, provocative smile touching her lips. "But if I'm to be a guest, Julian, I expect you to be much more attentive than you were as a master." Julian grinned, a flash of the rogue returning. "Oh, I plan to be very attentive, Miss Vance. In fact, I think we should start practicing right now." He pulled her back into his arms, the danger of being caught only adding a sharper edge to the desire that burned between them. The scandal was coming, but as Althea felt Julian's lips reclaim hers, she realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't surviving. She was finally, truly living. The rolling hills of Kent were a far cry from the suffocating soot of London, but for Althea, the transition from housekeeper to guest at Thorne Manor was the most difficult landscape she had ever navigated. She sat in the morning room, the sunlight catching the gold embroidery of a dress that hadn't been stitched by her own hands. For 2 weeks, they had lived in a dream, a world of long walks through apple orchards, whispered conversations over ancient books, and nights where Julian's touch made her forget she had ever been anything but his. But the dream was about to meet the waking world. Julian had called for his solicitor, and the local gossip had already begun to hum like a disturbed beehive. Althea looked at her hands, still calloused from years of work, and felt the old fear creeping back. Was she truly enough to stand beside a man like him, or was she just a servant wearing a costume? The door opened, and Julian walked in, looking more determined than she had ever seen him. He wasn't carrying ledgers or a glass of brandy. He was carrying a small, velvet box. "The solicitor is gone," he said, his voice ringing with strange, fierce pride. "The papers are drawn. My mother is already drafting a letter of outrage from her villa in Italy, and the local vicar is currently having a fainting spell. It's perfect." Althea stood, her heart hammering. Julian, you cannot be serious. To marry your housekeeper, they will call a scandal. They will say you've lost your mind. Let them, he said, crossing the room in 3 long strides. He took her hands in his grip firm and warm. I've spent 32 years being the sensible Viscount, following every dull rule laid out by people who don't know the first thing about happiness. And then you walked into my library and told me I was an ass. That was the moment I realized I couldn't live without you. Althea let out a watery laugh. I believe I said you were an insufferable ass, my lord. Precision is important. And that, Julian smiled, leaning his forehead against hers, is exactly why I need you. I don't need a wife who curtsies and agrees with my every whim. I need a woman who challenges me, who sees through my titles to the man beneath, and who makes my blood catch fire with a single look. He dropped to one knee, a gesture so traditional it felt revolutionary in their circumstances. He opened the box to reveal a sapphire ring, surrounded by a halo of diamonds. Althea Vance, you are the smartest, most provocative, and most beautiful woman I have ever known. You've managed my house for years. Now, I'm asking you to manage my heart. Will you marry me? Althea looked at the ring, then at the man she had loved in the shadows for so long. She thought of all the older women like her, the ones the world had told were past their prime, and she realized that her life wasn't ending. It was just beginning. On one condition, she whispered, her eyes shining with tears and mischief. Julian raised an eyebrow. Another condition, Miss Vance? That you never, ever tell me I'm late with the tea again. Julian laughed, a rich, joyful sound that echoed through the halls of the manor. He slid the ring onto her finger. A perfect fit. I wouldn't dream of it, my lady. He pulled her up into a kiss that tasted of 1,000 tomorrows. The scandal would come. The tongue would whisper and the world would stare. But as Althea felt Julian's arms wrap around her, she knew they had already won. She was no longer just a servant, and he was no longer just a viscount. They were 2 souls who found their match in the dark, and together they would burn brighter than any diamond in London. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It truly helps us bring you more tales of love, betrayal, and destiny. And if your heart still craves more, explore the other stories waiting for you here. You might just find your next obsession.